Hello everybody, and welcome to part 5 of West Virginia's True Ghost Stories by the Teltale Lilac Bush. And this story is going to talk about mine ghosts. Now, coal mines are usually haunted because once you die in the mine from a disaster or anything, you're basically buried in the mine. You're basically buried underground, so the soul is trapped in there apparently. So, we're going to start out with one of my favorite mine ghost stories, starting off with Big John's Ghost, right there. There's a picture of it right there. I like to see pictures. Alright. My grandfather was a coal miner all of his life. He had started to work in the coal mines of Wales when he was only 7 years old. He told many of his experiences in the mines, some of which I found quite hard to believe. One story I remembered very well was about a big Russian coal miner and an accident which took place when the Grant Town mine was just getting started. Grandfather said they called this man Big John because he was such a huge man. Big John loved to work and he loved to talk while he worked. Grandfather worked with Big John all day. John planted the charges to blow the coal mine out and Grandfather fixed the plunger. One day John was planting the dynamite in the vein of coal and Grandfather was around the corner fixing the plunger that generated the charge. All of a sudden he heard an explosion and a terrible scream. He ran around the corner to find Big John lying on the ground with his head completely blown off. A stick of dynamite had accidentally gone off. It was a terrible shock to Grandfather, for he and John had become close friends while they worked together. It seemed as if he could hear John talking while they were gone down the cage and while they worked. Now he was gone. One foggy morning about a month after the accident, Grandfather was going down by the cage all by himself. All of a sudden, he felt as if he were not alone. He slowly turned around. There before his eyes stood Big John holding his head onto his arm. The head smiled and spoke to Grandfather just as it used to do when at the Big John's shoulders. Grandfather was shut to his eyes and kept them shut until the cage hit bottom. When he opened them, Big John was gone. To this day, Grandfather will still get a funny look in his eyes when he tells the story how he would swear actually saw Big John. Who am I doubt this word? Wow. Now, you got to be careful working at a coal mine because one incident like that, like a dynamite going off, can blow off your head like a snap. So, I'm just letting you off. You want a coal mine. Alrighty then. This one is called South Section, Maine. Fire in the hole is a familiar cry to anyone who has worked in the coal mines. It means that they are ready to blast off sulfur balls. Sulfur balls are the miners' most dreaded enemies. They are 10 times harder than iron as there's a drill that can be drilled through the hard ones. When someone yells, "Fire in the hole," it means that you must take a quick action and cover yourself to the best way you can. Sometimes something goes wrong with the blasting. It's ribbling, it's weak, the whole ceiling will come down covering the section. That is exactly what happened when they blasted South Section, Maine in the Grant Town mine a few years ago. 6 men lost their lives, but a strange thing that were the bodies that were never found. Although that the section was close, but one still had to go through it on the way. One night, a buggy man who was on his way to pick up the men for the midnight shift. He had deposited one load and was on his way back with an empty man trip to pack up another load of men. While passing through the dreadful section, he saw 2 swinging red lanterns on each side of the tracks. He stopped the buggy beside them and one opened the man trip doors to get them in. When the buggy reached the miners, they waited for the buggy man to open the doors for them. When he did, the man trip was empty except for 2 burning red lanterns. They could figure out it because they quit using red lanterns since the cave-in up in South Section, Maine. A few weeks later, 2 buddies Hack Retton and Stanley Menleviz were walking into the battery room. Since it was midnight, the shift, they had nothing to do but wait until the batteries were charged. In the meantime, they would catch up to their steps. When the batteries were charged, a bell would ring, telling them it was about time to take off the charging units. They all had to worry about to take off the charging units. It was getting closer, either by the mine foreman of the section boss. Stan usually slept near the shack so he could hear it if anyone came to the battery shack. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when Stan was aroused from the deep sleep by footsteps outside. Thinking it was a foreman or section boss, he woke up Hack, and if they were both went to the door. 6 figures came walking toward them. There were about 6 miners swinging red lanterns passing on their way towards South Section Main. As the last one passed to the shack, he said in Polish, "Hi, Stan." Hack Retton did not know the men, but Stan did. The one who spoke to him was an old buddy who had been killed in the big explosion in Section South Main. When the story goes around the other miners, they wouldn't go near the section and made another route around it. Today the section was sealed up with 3 yards of cement, but despite of the thick walls, one can still hear the cries coming from Section South Main. Wow. What a disaster right there, because they had to stop using red lanterns because they could easily explode in a mine, killing tons of people. That one was really creepy. Alrighty then, next story, which is called The Ghost of Jeremy Walker. After an explosion at the Barrackville which killed a number of men, all of the bodies were found within the inspection of that old colored fellow by the name of Jeremy Walker. The thing that the men who had worked with Jeremy remembered about him, when his very boisterous laugh. He had worked in the cat-eye shift and was always trying to help someone fill the quota of coal. For the next 8 years after Jeremy's death, until hand-loading was no longer used in the mine, when the men would always fill their quota of coal. Whenever one of the miners would go to the foreman and tell him that he had not filled with the quota, the foreman would go back to check the amount of loaded and always filled with the quota filled, and a laugh like Jeremy's would be heard in the distance. The reason that the mysterious happening was never discovered, but the men who had worked there now by the men who since retired believed that the work was done by the ghost of Jeremy Walker. Wow. And did you know in that coal mine during the massive mine explosion, it is still on fire. You can still see the smoke coming out of the coal mine right there, which is still sealed up. And who knows when it's going to be, the flame will go out. Alrighty then. Moving on to the last story, which is kind of creepy. It's called Possessed. Fred Brown, a coal miner who is alive today and resides in Fairmont, lived with his brother John and John's wife in a part of town locally as Rat Row. Fred's worker at the old Gaston mine with Tony Jones, who also lived in Fairmont and is still alive. One day in 1914 began a series of events which are remembered and talked about this day. Fred, a normal, healthy man who had worked like everyone in the community. On the day changed suddenly and completely. It seemed that if he had become a different person. He stopped talking, he quit his job, and he was unable to lift any significant weight, although he was known to be a man of great strength. He began to wear a tie, although he had never worn one previously. His actions had become so strange that the people began to notice them and more. Many reasons for his new behavior were advanced to the people of Rat Row, but none could satisfactorily explain it. Rose Cooper, a local resident, claimed that he was possessed by the spirit of a dead person. With the idea in mind, she armed herself with a Bible and with Fred's home to have a talk with them. When she arrived only to Fred and John's wife there spoke. Upon seeing Mrs. Cooper's enter the door, Fred spoke up. "You finally came came, he said. Mrs. Cooper looked at him and said, "How many of the spirits has returned with you?" Fred refused to answer. Mrs. Cooper plied with him about more questions, but still remained silent. Finally, he demanded in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost talk. All these words Fred last broke sense when Mrs. Cooper asked him what he wanted. He replied, he was once a former landlady, Mrs. Thelma Parsons, to send money to a certain priest in Italy, where him to say mass for me with a temple open. This was an unusual request, since the tabernacle remains close to the door most of the mass in the Catholic Church. "Who are you?" said Mrs. Cooper, a chill creeping up in the spine. "I am Sam Vinci," he replied slowly. At the bottom, women shivered with fright as they knew who Sam Vinci was. He was a man who had been dead for 2 years, choked to death in a freak accident, the old Gaston mine. Mrs. Cooper finally became calm enough to inquire of Fred, or was it Sam, "Why did you come back in Fred's body? We knew that you were a decent man that cannot understand why you would do this to him." The spirit answered by saying and wanted a mass for himself, and went to thank Mrs. Cooper for treating him so kindly while he was alive. Mrs. Cooper talked to the spirit into letting her take care of the mass. She then asked to leave Fred's body, but to do in such a way that no one would be frightened. The spirit agreed, and after causing Fred to rub his hands over his face, it appeared to leave Fred's body, for after that, Fred seemed to return to normal. But later that night, after Mrs. Cooper had gone home, Fred walked into her home and without a word proceeded to step out in the house. His spirit returned. Mrs. Cooper wrote once the priest of Italy, who said for Sam Vinci, "Once more Fred returned to normal. The spirits have gone." To this day, Fred does not remember what happened during these 3 months of the spirits who possessed him. Wow. So he was being possessed by the spirit who was killed in the coal mine. Very impressive. Alrighty then, the next and final story that I want to read to you, it's my favorites, is the Headless Ghosts. That's going to be very creepy, and it's the last chapter of West Virginia's True Ghost Stories.